Hi everyone, and welcome to another In Conversations with Vaughan. A bit self-absorbing when you think about that name. I'm joined by Lauren Fernandes, who is our Head of Thought Leadership based out of Toronto in Canada for North America for Nielsen. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks for having me, Vaughan. Excited to be here and chat through some trends.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lauren's been a big part of some of the thought leadership that Nielsen's pulled together over the last 12 months that are coming out of our COVID initiatives, talking about consumer behavior. And as we start to pivot, I'm really interested, Lauren, to sort of talk today about what are the unique elements that are happening out of the US versus Asia and obviously Canada as well, when I talk about that, North America in general.
Yeah,
But also,
I
what are we going to see in the future?
I think we've seen some interesting trends lately, particularly, as key areas of the US have kind of experienced new rises or fresh outbreaks of the virus. It's been a really interesting time from a consumer behavior standpoint, I would say. So we've been able to draw some interesting parallels and looking across the globe and then comparing US FMCG trends to really kind of make some key predictions on where we think behavior is going to head out. So we saw, interestingly, that total FMCG purchase trend didn't actually spike quite dramatically, despite a lot of the local transmission that we witnessed happening in the US. And so that really led us to kind of think about ways that behavior and consumer purchasing is going to pivot moving forward, particularly as markets might experience those fresh outbreaks of the virus or potentially get into a wave two scenario. And so that's where we really start to think about the basket that's going to reset, the behaviors in the home that have lingered throughout this pandemic, really shifting that increase in in-home spending that we're seeing, right down to things like the rationale behind how people buy, and that's really shifted. And so a lot of these trends are really kind of manifesting in North America, but also across the globe in terms of how people are rethinking all of the purchase decisions that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things in Asia we've seen dramatically is the difference between more developed countries and developing nations. And one that really comes to mind is in Asia, we see Singapore's growth in FMCG has been dramatic, whereas a lot of the emerging and developing countries haven't seen anywhere near that level of growth. We know there's reasons behind it, cash flow, etc. What are you seeing in the US? Does that diversity also exist within cities and towns as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of pitted it out into two different kind of consumer groups or profiles that are emerging. So we've got constrained spenders, as we're calling them, and insulated spenders. So two different groups of consumers whose incomes and health have been differently impacted by the virus. So we've got insulated spenders who likely haven't seen their impact from an income standpoint because of the virus. And so they've got a little bit more padding in their wallets, in their day to day budgets. And so their spending for FMCG has likely increased and will continue to increase as they start to consider a broader set of essentials in their basket, as they're feeling less of the bite in terms of what they can and can't spend on. Meanwhile, we have those constrained spenders who really have had that income slashed because of a number of factors related to the pandemic and the economic ramifications of that. And so those constrained spenders, even in North America, are really kind of scrutinizing that budget. And so when they think about resetting the basket to today's needs, they're going to be cutting out some essentials in place of ones that have kind of bubbled to the forefront as they're purchasing more things related to the pandemic, so more cleaning products, more masks, more um, protective equipment. Those are going to come at the cost of other essentials as they're thinking about pantry staples. All of those decisions are going to be more heavily, I guess, weighed against what they have to spend. And so we're definitely seeing that polarization in terms of consumers who are feeling flexible and kind of indulging through CPG, and those who are using the consumer goods space to really kind of make essential decisions and whittle down their purchasing wherever they can.
If we take that a little further and we consider that in Asia, especially right now, we've seen changing dining habits, working from home, and in general, the economic hardships that's changing consumers' behavior dramatically. Where do you see North America in general in terms of the longer term impacts of this pandemic? Are there specific trends that you think are 3 to 5 years in their behaviors that are not going to change overnight?
Definitely. So, one of the things we've been really exploring is the concept of affordability and how that's really going to shift not just today, but into the next 3 to 5 years. And so, if we're thinking about a constrained consumer, there's some really key implications to, the type of price architecture that consumers are going to engage with. So, knowing that some consumers may not be able to afford, let's say, those bulk economy sizes of a product just because they can't foot the upfront bill of paying for that level of or size of product across all the products that they buy. We might see some consumers shifting back to the single format or the individual size, and although that's probably not the most economical in terms of economies of scale, some consumers won't be able to access those bulk value size products. And so that concept of value really shifts when you think about consumers who are then focused on that price per unit, what they can afford, and what they will then be willing to put into their basket. And then on the other side of things, the pandemic really limited the number of promotions that were able
Mm.
to happen and exist in a store at one time. So it's really driven a kind of historic moment where promotions were at an all-time low. So the sales sold on promotion, particularly in the US, I think around the May and June period was the lowest we've seen in the last 4 years. And so it's really a momentous time for companies to think about how they reset that concept of affordability, how they begin to reissue promotions back into the in-store and online environment. And so, how companies put forward those promotions is going to be different. And so, whether you issue promotions with greater efficiency on the company's end, but also tailored to how consumers are now thinking about their budgets and their wallets, I think that's definitely going to be a huge factor moving forward into the next, 3, 5 years or more on how companies compete on price and how they manage the assortment that's available on shelves to match the new budget sensitivities that exist today.
So let's just take one stream of that for a moment, because I completely agree with you when you think about this resetting of price promotions. What I have read, and I was reading most recently, it was about price promotions and where consumers are now looking for them. Because price promotions disappeared throughout COVID, we didn't re-educate consumers fully, right? Because those constrained consumers are desperate for price.
Exactly.
And I see now that they're using e-commerce more so than ever before to try and find that price. What are the roles of retailers moving forward in North America, which I'm guessing is very similar? The bricks and mortar guys starting to play more of a role in that online omni-channel approach?
Definitely. So I think now more than ever that I guess promotional landscape includes online, and it's so much more omni-channel than ever. We're seeing across North America that growth in e-commerce, while it's stabilizing, it's certainly continuing to be strong and well above the norm that we saw prior to COVID. And so, measures in July, we saw, I think, 64% increases in trips, 21% more items in basket. So consumers who were kind of forced to adopt online throughout this pandemic have certainly demonstrated that stickiness and that willingness to stay with online channels. And so that's a huge consideration when you're talking about how you're going to reset your promotional strategies moving forward, because now you have a whole online environment that is more important and more integral than ever before. And so retailers and even manufacturers are going to have to think about the introduction of promotions that kind of spans both online and offline worlds, so that you're meeting the price sensitivity and the needs that consumers have, particularly constrained consumers who are shopping online and, as you said, in need of that support from a price standpoint, making sure that that same support or similar support exists online and offline is going to be really important.
And I know as we're predicting the COVID-19 behavioral reset, we talked a bit about affordability, but another major one is that homebody reset. We're just not going to rush back to the office, right? We know that. And we know in Asia, we already have great food delivery groups. We have this offline to online that I've spoken about on nearly every one of these discussions. Are you seeing similar trends in North America where people are spending more time at home, how they eat has changed, when they eat? It's going to be a real challenge, right? Is that something happening there?
Definitely. I think one of the most interesting things in our latest piece of content was just exploring the staying power of that homebody reset was really remarkable. We saw, you know, obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, there was that huge spike in products suited to that at-home environment. So, a lot of definitely food preparation products, beauty care, hair care, all of those products were obviously spiking as consumers were forced to kind of do everything within the four walls of their home. But interestingly, even as lockdowns have lifted throughout the US and Canada and more businesses have opened up, more, life has slowly returned to a state where, you can exist beyond the four walls of your house. Those spikes have kind of stayed quite high and well above the 2019 norms. So we've seen continued growth in a lot of do-it-yourself type products, whether it's home improvement, whether it's, again, hair care, beauty care, and those specialty products from a food standpoint, sushi making kits, tortilla making products, meal kits, all of these products that really support the continued importance of fulfilling needs within the home have continued to grow. And so a lot of that growth that was spearheaded by lockdowns has really transitioned into long-term behavior change and habits that have continued to be fulfilled at home. And so that growth is huge. I think the other impact you mentioned is, people are working from home. And so there's certainly a local impact there too, where consumers who used to fulfill X number of their needs close to their office or near their place of work or where they were eating, lunches and such within, a proximity of their office buildings, a lot of that has moved either into home and fulfilled through their grocery shopping, or they're, ordering online and having things delivered to their homes to meet all of those new needs.
Yeah, and that offline to online element that we've seen in Asia has grown rapidly. So originally that was very much in a quick serve restaurant style, you want something, but we've seen premier restaurants take the place, and now we're starting to see basic fruit and vegetables and meats being delivered online. Originally, when we saw this happening, we saw this being driven in Asia because one, out of health and the necessity, we're either locked down or restricted on where we could actually move depending upon the country we're in. But right now, I'm noticing more and more of that happening because of price, which comes back a little bit to that piece that we spoke about, affordability, right? Which is interesting. So I wonder, as we move forward, because of the cost base of online versus the bricks and mortar guys, whether this is going to become a competitive advantage, particularly if the quality of product is going to be there. Do you see some of these trends as well?
Definitely. I think, we did some survey work that talked about, what are the factors that make you switch stores? And as a consumer, how those priorities shifted. And, perhaps not surprisingly, promotions and price points were one of the top factors, once again, for driving that switch between a different retailer. And I think it plays into, also that element of satisfaction and how, certainly many consumers were forced to move to an online environment out of needs for protection and health. And that was a huge driver at the beginning of the pandemic. But as, conditions have persisted in the long term, satisfaction is a huge driver for particularly online purchases now that many more retailers have kind of rushed to really build and bolster their online infrastructure. Consumers now, especially as fulfillment is regulated, they have their choice in terms of, who they're going to choose to fulfill their regular needs. And so that quality, that online satisfaction, that experience, and reliability of fulfillment are all factors in addition to price that are going to rise to the forefront. And so um, certainly consumers might feel a little bit more in the driver's seat now where they can be more choosy and selective in terms of the retailers that fulfill their omni-channel needs today.
A bit of a personal story. This afternoon, I was outside my house and my neighbor, who's a Singaporean, was making a beef broth, out of bone beef broth, I should say.
Oh, wow.
And I said to them, why are you doing it out of that? And they were doing it outside on a cooker. And the guy said to me, it's all about health and well-being. You can have some, Vaughan. This will prevent COVID. And it's sort of, I thought, wow, whatever works, right?
Yeah, but I think, people are doing stuff like that all the time where they're using their home space in unique ways, in new ways, whether it's driven by the virus, and wanting to kind of protect themselves, but also it's just, I think consumers are embracing so many different innovative ways to do things on their properties and within, the safety of their home space. So it's really an interesting time.
Absolutely. So I figure we don't need a vaccine. We can just use the beef bone broth from my neighbor and we're all safe. But the reason why we're getting to that is we have a lot of local manufacturers that listen to this as well. And one of the questions they're asking is, historically, we've seen trends move from the west to the east. But are you starting to see trends coming from Asia that are starting to move into the US? And I don't suspect it's the bone broth, but are there other trends that you would sort of share that are coming from Asia that you think
Definitely.
could be something to take?
Totally. At the start of the pandemic, especially, I think we saw a lot of trends kind of originate from Asia and really influence kind of the long-term management of COVID-19 in North America. So that integration of health and wellness measures and all the safety checks and ways in which businesses were returning to operation, those were hugely influential to North America and how, we kind of deployed certain practices and integrated certain products from a health and wellness standpoint into everyday routines. I think in particular, things like touchless elements to delivery and fulfillment. A lot of that was inspired by a lot of the advancements that took place in Asia and then now kind of have manifested throughout North America. A lot of the, I guess, automation sometimes in service models and the ability for, again, practices to be done in a touch-free or limited touch environment. I feel like those things have come really into demand lately. And a lot of that, was started in places like China, where, a lot of these practices were really just accelerated and disseminated quite quickly. And so in North America, we kind of had that point of learning to see how things can be done in a safe way, kind of as businesses reopened. So, I mean, those are some of the early ones we've seen, but certainly I think more to come as, global trends indicate, certain markets are going through those second waves or early new spikes in virus transmission. We're going to have to learn how to kind of come out of those similarly in safe ways. So I think there's definitely been a huge knowledge transfer globally in that way.
That's exciting for us. I think the other area that we continue to look at is this localization. So whether it's out of necessity or it's because of a desire to help your local neighbor, certainly in Asia and within certain markets, and even within the markets down to neighborhood levels, we've seen consumers start to buy more and more, even micro-local. Are you seeing similar trends in North America?
Definitely. I think consumers are really embracing all of the aspects that their, their neighborhoods can provide them. I think COVID-19 has really focused people and their attention to how far their products have traveled before they've gotten to, their table, for example. And so that increased scrutiny on those global touch points has really been a a good thing for a lot of local businesses who have played a key role in need fulfillment, particularly during lockdown. So, in lockdown, you were forced to kind of rely on what you could access within your neighborhood or within your local area. And a lot of those, I guess, early behavior shifts have turned into habits, and people have see, seen like a lot of enjoyment from the fulfillment in their neighborhood. The quality of local produce, for example, or maybe it's the reliability of and the relationships that could be built with a business kind of within, close quarters. So I think a lot of that has been really beneficial to local businesses. There's been even, some local pride and local, I guess, um, goodwill kind of developed in supporting locals. So all of those aspects, I think, are really driving some opportunities for the small players, for consumers.
We talk about predicting again that the next reset of what's going to occur with consumers. We've spoken a bit about basket reset. We've talked about the home body reset. We've talked a fair bit about that affordability reset. One area that interests me is the rationale reset, where we're seeing some consumers seeking a bit more luxury. We're seeing also the disparity of wealth probably get amplified a little bit at the moment. What worries me is the lack of innovation that's occurring in markets. And I'm a bit worried that if manufacturers don't adapt and retailers don't adapt, consumers are going to leave them in droves, right? So are you seeing similar trends in North America?
Definitely. I think the rationale reset in particular is something that companies really need to recognize and embrace, particularly in the realm of innovation, because I think consumers and what companies need to realize is that consumers are really rethinking and redefining why they buy things and what certain products are used for. So as consumers, can't travel or feel as though they cannot splurge in ways that they could, and, safety becomes a factor limiting a lot of out-of-home expenses, they're turning to consumer goods in ways they've never had to or never thought of before. And so that's a breeding ground for great innovation. And so companies shouldn't really be putting the brakes on innovation at all. They should be embracing um, the number of new use cases that have emerged for consumer goods. So when we think about a fine dining experience and all of the new consumer goods that are now associated with that type of thought process, there's a huge opportunity for companies to um, innovate in the messaging that they kind of put forward with their product. There are ways to innovate around, the packaging or the, I guess, positioning of a product so that it does fit all of the new use cases a product might have. So, even from a budget standpoint, consumers who are buying that premium cut of meat to really kind of splurge and indulge, down to consumers who are using health and beauty products available in the store to replicate spa-like experiences. There's so many new ways that products could be innovated to kind of appeal to a giftable nature or to a luxury nature that maybe they never really had the I guess reach to do so. Now a lot of new concepts are kind of coming closer to the realm of where products exist. And so it's really an interesting space where even from a constrained consumer standpoint, if they're buying a box of cookies, that might be more of a luxury than ever before, given how much more it represents in their weekly budget. And so even small products, even indulgent products, all have a new runway for how consumers are using and thinking about them. So it's a really interesting time.
And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for companies today is that consumers are seeking new things all the time. The trends we thought that were 3 to 5 years away are here today.
Yeah.
And these guys are struggling with, how do I innovate in an environment that is changing so dramatically overnight? But I think the challenge is with range rationalization, more private label hitting the shelves, this challenge around price, this online and offline world that's challenging us. It's incredibly difficult for companies today. And I know in North America, it's a similar trend here in Asia. This isn't going to go away overnight, right?
And I think that, if anything, it highlights the importance of innovation testing and developing concepts that are likely to succeed because things have changed so dramatically. It almost just highlights why now is a good time to explore those innovative concepts before they're kind of executed so that you can get it right against this whole new set of dynamics that have emerged in a very fast and disruptive way.
Absolutely. And it's that the constrained and insulated, the omni-channel, the omni-shopper, there's just so much going on, right? It's crazy times. We know that at a personal level. We're all working from home. But when you start to really delve into it from a company that's trying to execute, how do they simplify it is going to be really the question, because you can't be everything to everyone, but you certainly have to make sure that you have an availability of products to the majority, right? And on each of those different formats, those different retail networks.
And I think you really have to think about the consumer journey. So the consumer that you're looking to capture, thinking really realistically and granularly about how that consumer has had to pivot their lives right now, I think is a really great way to sort of dive in a simple way. So if you start to think about whether your target consumer is more likely insulated or constrained, that right there gives you a whole different set of criteria to kind of zoom in on. And then as we start to think about, we've bucketed a lot of these changes into the 4 groups that we've been talking about today. So, hone in on each one of those and explore what that means for your brand or for your product. So when you think about the basket reset, we kind of put out a great set of descriptive criteria as to what that could mean in both an insulated and a constrained environment. So honing in on the basket reset for an insulated spender is going to include a number of different essentials than existed about 6 months ago. And so kind of really zooming in, thinking about what's changed, and kind of how that will differ by different targets of consumers is really important. And I mean, just to add to that, I think it's a really interesting time we're in where a lot of conditions are colliding at once. So not only are we in a global pandemic, but we're seeing some of the most seismic economic shifts we've ever seen. And so the intersection of those 2 factors is driving this change faster and more dramatically than we could have ever expected.
Absolutely. Hey, Lauren, I know I've taken up a fair bit of your time. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time and sharing some great insights with us.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. And this was great.
Yeah. And if there's any questions you want to come and ask, you can come to the your Nielsen person, your client service associate, or contact us at Nielsen in the email addresses available or the websites, and we'll be able to help you out further. So thank you. Thanks for everyone's time.